Good day, everyone. It is so nice to have you with us. I want to welcome you to our webinar, Gazing Through the Crystal Ball, Psychedelic Science and FDA Policy in a Shifting Political Era. I'm Shannon Smedella, and I'm honored that you're joining us for the webinar that I think you'll find incredibly interesting. To start us off, we'd love to know where you're joining us from today. So as you hop on the webinar, feel free to drop your city or country in the chat, because I know we have people joining us from all over the world today. Before we begin, I'd like to note that the views expressed during today's session are those of the speakers in their personal capacity and do not necessarily reflect the views of Clearmind. Additionally, nothing shared in this discussion should be interpreted as medical advice or as an endorsement of any psychedelic substances that are not approved or regulated by appropriate authorities. So now we are going to get right into the webinar and some introductions. We are gathering at a pivotal time in psychedelic space, and as many of you know, the FDA's recent decision on MDMA-assisted therapy has sparked a wave of reflection, recalibration, and renewed dialogue across the field. So today's conversation will explore what this moment means for research, regulation, innovation, and ethics, and how we can move forward with clarity, calibration, and purpose. And we're incredibly fortunate to be joined by four extraordinary thought leaders with deep experience across the psychedelic landscape. Each of our speakers today brings a unique lens from nonprofit advocacy to academic research and clinical practice to biotech and innovation, giving us a truly comprehensive view of where the field is headed. So let's introduce them. And as I introduce each speaker today, we'll also drop their social handles and websites in the chat so you can also follow their work. So let's start off with Rick Doblin. Rick is the founder and president of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, also known as MAP. He holds a PhD in public policy from Harvard, where his research focused on the medical regulation of psychedelics and cannabis. Rick has spent over 4 decades advocating for safe, legal use of psychedelics, and he founded MAPS in 1986 to advance that mission. We're especially excited to have him with us today as he prepares for Psychedelic Science coming up next month, the world's largest gathering on psychedelic medicine, science, and policy. So Rick brings the nonprofit and policy lens today in the discussion. And for those who would like to support MAP's ongoing nonprofit work, we'll be dropping a donation link in the chat as well. Next, we have Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. He is the Ralph Metzner Distinguished Professor in Neurology and Psychiatry at UCSF with a PhD in neuropharmacology. He has led groundbreaking research on psychedelics, including LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA, and has published in top-tier journals. Dr. Carhart-Harris was named among the top 31 medical scientists in the Times newspaper in 2020, listed in Times Magazine's 100 Next in 2021, and voted Psychedelic Researcher of the Year in 2021. He brings a rigorous academic and research lens to today's panel. Next, we have Mark Haden. Mark is the Vice President of Business Development at Clearmind and a longtime leader in psychedelic policy and public health. He's previously served as the Executive Director of MAPS Canada for over a decade and is currently an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia School of Population and Public Health. Mark brings over 30 years of experience in addiction and mental health fields, having worked in counseling, clinical supervision, and policy development. His work bridges science, clinical application, and social change. Mark brings the clinical and public health perspectives to today's conversation. And last but not least, Dr. Zuloff-Shani is a biomedical research and development executive with over 20 years of strategic and operational leadership in the healthcare industry. She holds a PhD in human biology and has led regulatory R&D and clinical operations across a wide range of therapeutic areas. Dr. Zuloff-Shani is the Chief Executive Officer of Clearmind Medicine, where she leads the company's innovative work in psychedelic drug development, including its flagship compound, MEAI, for alcohol use disorder and other mental health conditions. She brings the industry lens to today's discussion. So before we dive into today's panel, I'd like to welcome Dr. Zuloff-Shani, CEO of Clearmind, to say a few opening remarks. Adi, I think you're still on mute.
So true. So thank you, Shannon, and thank you, everyone. I'm really, really excited to have you here for our webinar, Gazing Through the Crystal Ball, Psychedelic Science and FDA Policy in a Shifting Political Era. And we are deeply grateful to have three extraordinary pioneers with us, Dr. Rick Doblin, Dr. Robin Carhart, and Mark Haden, whose contributions have shaped the landscape of psychedelic research and policy. Their insights could not be more timely as the world watches this field evolve at a rapid and critical pace. At Clearmind, we are driven by a clear mission to transform mental health and well-being through the development of novel psychedelic-derived therapeutics. We believe that bold science, paired with ethical vision and compassionate care, can address some of the most widespread and underserved health challenges like alcoholism and obesity. And we're proud to hosting this webinar as a free and public event because we believe this conversation should be open, accessible, and inclusive. So thank you for being here, and we hope you'll stay with us for a thoughtful and forward-looking discussion.
Thank you, Adi, and thank you for those opening remarks and for your leadership. So let's now turn to our panel discussion. We'll explore the FDA's recent decision and what it means for research, regulation, and the future of psychedelic therapies. I'll guide us through a few key themes, and we'll leave time at the end for an audience Q&A. So feel free to drop your questions in the questions button at the bottom of the webinar as we go. So we're going to head right into these questions, and I would like to start out with a question for Rick. So Rick, you've been at the heart of this work for decades, and for those who may not be fully caught up to speed, could you walk us through what the FDA's official response to Lykos was in August, and what stood out most to you about it?
Well, let me first say that the official response to Lykos from the FDA came in the form of what's called a complete response letter, a CRL, that outlined their concerns. Unfortunately, Lykos is no longer really following the policy of transparency that I created when MAPS was really in charge. And so that letter has not been made public. However, there's been a series of press releases from Lykos and interviews and discussions in Psychedelic Alpha. So there's a lot that's in the public domain that's already been speculated about what was in that letter. The basic thing is that FDA didn't say, oh, we will never approve MDMA, it's too risky, or it doesn't work. The FDA said, we're not persuaded by the evidence yet. There's been so much confusion about whether the data is valid, about whether there was bias. They raised this issue of functional unblinding as one of the main concerns, even though FDA itself chose the design to be with therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose MDMA. But those people, we did that with the FDA in 2017. And then those people left the FDA and new, more conservative people. But what we do know is that FDA has said at the time that they're interested in another phase 3 study of some sort. However, FDA also didn't really explain why. Is it because there's more information needed for safety? Is it because there's more information needed for efficacy? So the negotiation, as I see it, is going to be about whether there really needs to be, with this new administration that's sympathetic with psychedelics and has publicly said that in many different ways, that there could either be approval within 6 months or so with a phase 4 study. So phase 4 are post-approval requirements to gather additional data. There's almost certainly going to be a patient registry to track outcomes from every patient that receives MDMA, at least for this initial period of time. So the issue is whether there'll be another phase 3 study, which could delay things 4 years or so from now, if there really needs to be another phase 3 study, or if the FDA would say, well, we accept your data, we will approve it, and we will require phase 4 studies. So that's where I think we're at. The 2 phase 3 studies that were submitted by Lykos were quite persuasive, in my personal opinion, in terms of both the statistical significance, the large effect size, the very low dropout rate compared to traditional psychotherapies. For example, the VA did a study, took them about 6 years and 916 veterans, and compared prolonged exposure with cognitive processing therapy, 2 different kinds of non-drug psychotherapies. Needless to say, it wasn't a double-blind study at all, but they still considered the results valid. But they had over 50%, about 50% on average, of the subjects dropped out of the study because the therapy was re-traumatizing. And so with the MDMA, we had extremely low dropout from the people that received MDMA. There's something about MDMA that helps people process difficult emotions and difficult traumas, and they get a sense of hope, and they want to stay in the study. So my sense is that MDMA will eventually be made into a medicine by the FDA for post-traumatic stress disorder. When that will actually happen, it's not clear. There is new investors coming into Lykos that are more committed to public benefit than the old group, and that are fully capitalized and have all the resources that will be necessary. So I'm hoping that they will return to a policy of transparency, meaning that they will publish the CRL, they will publish the data. You know, we're at a time now where, unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation, much of it coming from our US government. And so I think that there will be a lack of trust in whatever the FDA does, whether they approve it and have a phase 4 study, or whether they say they need another phase 3 study. So I think the antidote, in a way, to that lack of trust is transparency, is to make all the data public, to make the criticisms public, to make the responses to those criticisms public. One of the things that a bunch of the therapists are doing right now is submitting a defense and explanation of how our therapeutic method worked, how it was standardized, how it was delivered with fidelity as determined by adherence raters, to answer some of the criticisms that were leveled at the FDA Advisory Committee. So in any case, in the long run, I'm very hopeful. I'm almost certain that MDMA will eventually become a medicine, but what happens within the next 6 months is unclear.
Thanks so much, Rick. And we're going to talk about the FDA and the new administration as well. And you touched on a key term, which is transparency, which we'll talk about going forward. Now, the anticipation for the August news and the aftermath of the August news last year sent a ripple through the entire field. So I'll leave this question open to everyone, maybe Robin, Rick, Mark, if you want to jump in here. From your vantage points, what do you see as the broader implications of this moment for the future of psychedelic research? So did this announcement have broader implications in the whole field from your perspective?
Well, maybe I'll just say something very quickly, and then we can hear from Mark and Robin. But what I'll say is I think that the whole field is getting the wrong message. And the message is, oh, the FDA doesn't regulate psychotherapy, so let's just become traditional drug companies that really talk about drugs but don't do anything about the therapy. Don't train therapists, leave all that to the marketplace somehow or other. And so we see virtually all, even Lykos to some extent, running away from focusing on what's best for patients, which is drug plus therapy, and just saying, as pharma companies, they will just try to sell drugs, and they'll try to get the drugs approved, and they all look to Spravato, ketamine by Johnson & Johnson, that as a tremendous success. They're over $1 billion a year in annual sales. They're projected to go to $2 billion. It's not what's best for patients. Some early research is demonstrating suggestions that ketamine with therapy is more durable and deeper than ketamine without therapy. So there are broader implications, and I think they're almost entirely negative with this idea of the pharma companies running away from therapy.
On the optimistic side, Rick reached out to me and said, what can we bring to Canada? And then we had a discussion, and right now people involved with the MAPS training can't experience MDMA as part of their training process. And so Rick asked me if we could bring that piece of it to Canada. I submitted a protocol to Health Canada that was approved. Ethics also approved it, and we got Section 56 approval, which means we're allowed to possess MDMA. So far, Health Canada has been at least neutral. They're not against psychedelic research. They're kind of going through all the regular hurdles. They have also, Health Canada has also allowed access to MDMA and psilocybin through a process called the SAP, Special Access Program. So I would describe Health Canada as being neutral, which is probably as good as it can get. So Canada is open to psychedelic research.
Well, I should say that, FDA is open to psychedelic research too. It's just that they weren't ready to go beyond that.
Yeah, and I'll add in that Rick's right to flag the sort of paradigm challenge there. I guess what we heard from the FDA, at least in the advisory committee meeting, was this struggle with the psychotherapy component, and how the model as it is doesn't, it's not a good fit. It doesn't know what to do with that. This pure pharmacotherapy model, pure drug model, has dominated mental health care for so long, and its roots go into the major institutions, whether it's mouse research motivating the development of new compounds. Very few actually cross over into being a human medicine, and then when they do they really treat human beings, individuals, and human societies in a positive way? We can look at a bunch of stats and say it's not clear that that's happening, that we're dropping prevalence and really making major breakthroughs in terms of improving treatment success. So there's something kind of systemic in the system that ain't working in mental health care. And so psychedelic therapy brings a very interesting paradigm challenge that, in my view, sheds a light actually on a lot of the systemic issues that haven't yielded enough positive breakthrough. That combination treatment aspect, drug times therapy, is one. However we play with the semantics, is it therapy, is it psychotherapy, is it contextual manipulation? The principle that the context is essentially important is one that we all hold, I think, in this space. One could argue that the science could be a bit more systematic to test it and demonstrate it. That's something I'm working on at the moment at UCSF. But another component that'll probably come in our conversation, and I might be preempting it, is how the FDA dealt with the blinding issue as well. And that's another, part of the current paradigm that's treated almost as sacrosanct, that we all must have, blinding integrity throughout. It's not the reality, we know. Blinding is often broken, in a sense, invalidated in clinical trial research generally. But a bright spotlight was shone on the MDMA phase 3 work in that respect. And I think it was sort of double standards. Blinding has been an issue for a long time, and yet it was lifted up as a special issue in this case. I think we need to remind ourselves why we do blinding, that it's to demonstrate a direct causal action that is greater than a mere expectancy effect. And so there's something that's happening right now that I think can be useful in the long run in terms of shining a spotlight on even how we do clinical trial research, and perhaps some of the limitations of current paradigms Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to add one bit to what Robin said about this expectancy effect. So that what we demonstrated, if you look at the results in the group that got therapy with no MDMA, and that was largely knowable by both patients and therapists, whether they received the MDMA or whether they received the placebo. In the second phase 3 study that we had, 47.6% of the people who received therapy with no MDMA at all no longer had PTSD at the 2-month follow-up. In the first study of severe PTSD, it was 32%, no longer had PTSD without any MDMA at all, when most of these people really knew that they didn't get the MDMA and that the therapist knew that as well. So that just demonstrates this idea of, were the therapists biased? Did they stop trying for the people that got the placebo, or did they try extra hard for the people that got the MDMA? And so what we can see is that the results were as good or better than any of the other psychotherapies that are used for PTSD, with a much lower dropout rate in the people that got therapy with no MDMA at all. So I think that goes a lot to address this concern of, was functional unblinding actually reducing bias in the way that the therapists were responding to their patients?
And if it's all right, I could be really brief here, but another way we can tackle this is to measure expectancy up front at the start of a trial. That's something that we did in a psilocybin therapy for major depressive disorder trial in a head-to-head with escitalopram, Lexapro. We asked for expectancy ratings for each treatment and actually found that pre-trial expectancy for positive benefit with a psilocybin wasn't predictive of the positive benefit, wasn't predictive of the response. It was for escitalopram. If you think you're going to do well with that drug, lo and behold, you do well with that drug. But that relationship didn't hold for psilocybin. I think there's really something important in that finding, because it suggests to me just what we're trying to do with blinding, that the treatment is substantive, that it does something over and above a mere snake oil positive expectancy effect. And so I think as a rule now, perhaps we should measure pre-trial expectancy, pre-intervention expectancy across trials. And that's an example of how, we're learning, in a sense, how to improve rigor in clinical trial research, and that spotlight having been shone by perhaps the special nature of psychedelic therapy and its action.
Robin, if I understand you correctly, to measure expectancy is extremely cheap, right? You just give a very self-report questionnaire. It hardly costs anything.
It's so easy. 0 to 100. 100 is complete remission. 0 is no change. So you've got your variance there. And then you look to see whether that relates to how well people respond. And directionally, actually, it was in the opposite direction to what we're used to. So those with really high, you might say inflated expectations, didn't do quite so well, whereas those with low expectations, which is common in depression, have their expectations exceeded by the actual response. I think that was the major picture. Low expectations in depression, nothing's going to work for me. And lo and behold, with this intervention, they did fantastically well. So it was a great finding in that respect. And I'd like to see it, tested further in the future.
Great, thanks so much. So this ties in a little bit to what you've just been talking about here, Rick and Robin, but the question is, are researchers facing new challenges in protocol design as a result of this regulatory feedback? And is there any insight into the future for research?
There was one aspect. There has been some effort to try to study psychedelics without any therapy, whatever that means, but it's even without this quote psychological support. So MindMed, to be specific, had some quite misleading press releases about LSD for generalized anxiety disorder, without any therapy at all, when they actually had therapists and psychiatrists in the room at the time, but they were saying don't do therapy. So I think there has been some pressure to try to find the pure pharmacological effect, which carries ethical questions. If you take somebody that has, severe PTSD and you just say, here's some MDMA and we'll leave you alone, they could easily get worse. The support that you get from the therapist really makes a big difference when you're confronting some of the scariest things that have happened in your own life. But then again, if you have people in the room that are to provide support and then you tell them don't do therapy, but they're still there supporting, is that really no therapy? It doesn't save anybody any money if you're still paying for therapists, but you're telling them not to be therapy. But I think that there has been that kind of effort to try to isolate the pure pharmacological effect without human intervention in the context in some ways, but that doesn't seem really practical because they're not going to say, okay, let somebody take LSD or psilocybin or MDMA in a room all by themselves with nobody there for a period of time. That's not gonna happen.
It's misleading for the research base, and it's potentially dangerous for the public. Still currently most people take psychedelics outside of any legal jurisdiction in the underground or whatever context. And so to hear that, or to be encouraged in a sense to think that the therapy isn't so important and to question that is a dangerous message. And to Rick's point, it's not even accurate what's being done in, say, the MindMed is the best example, but also Compass, they call it psychological support, so it's still there. But the developers know that the system isn't set up for psychotherapy, so they downplay it. But then that portrays this dangerous message. The other problem that's come through is this idea of non-psychedelic psychedelics that is an oxymoron, and so there's a hint that it's sort of illogical even in the term. I've had grants rejected by NIMH because they've appealed to the mouse research showing in a mouse that a mouse doesn't head twitch with a compound but still gets some antidepressant behavioral benefit, they claim. And so we should be guided by that in the human research that we do, almost like lifting up the little mouse as our ground truth. It's absurd. I call it the murine industrial complex. It's like, the mouse is master in a sense. And it's a shame. I wanted to do a trial blocking a certain serotonin receptor, giving psilocybin to see if that receptor in the trip that follows, it's the serotonin 2A receptor, was critical to antidepressant benefit. And they said, oh, no, don't do that work because the mouse research shows that a mouse can move around more without twitching its head. Therefore, we could develop non-psychedelic psychedelics. It's really an absurdity. And again, it's an example of a system that is generating, substandard treatments that has these sort of gold standard principles that are actually quite fallible. And so I really think, another shout to optimism, psychedelic therapy and understanding this model, and that it's a paradigm challenge should be embraced. And if embraced, it can really be a breakthrough for mental health care.
Thanks so much, Robin. And just a quick question here, because I know there are some people joining us today who don't have a background in psychedelics. So I just wanted to open this up to everyone just for the experience of our audience today, because you touched on non-psychedelic psychedelics. Are all psychedelics hallucinogenic? And do all psychedelics, including the novel ones, need to be taken with therapy?
Well, I'll just say that I don't think MDMA is very, quote, hallucinogenic, in that it doesn't have the same kind of visual distortions or visual impact. But I would also say that LSD and psilocybin are not actually hallucinogenic either.
Yeah.
I think that's a really pejorative word meant to imply that it's all false and that it's all delusion and nothing's real about it. I think what it's like is like your visual perception is really influenced for sure under LSD or psilocybin, and you can actually see sort of how emotions impact your visual input, what you're seeing, but that people don't usually think about it as complete delusion, like, oh, I'm seeing something in the tree, I'm seeing all these images in the clouds. but there is usually this sense that that's you don't take it for real. Like there's not this chariot running through the sky, or so I think hallucinogenic itself is an older word that
I agree.
yeah,
I
the main
agree.
people that you see using it are the ones that are funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse
Yeah,
or NIH.
and it does conjure that connotation of psychosis and auditory hallucinations, hearing things, that aren't there in the immediate environment. In a sense, the field moved away from hallucinogen in 1957 or so when psychedelic was coined. Psychedelic as revealing the psyche, illuminating the psyche, making aspects of the psyche manifest that are ordinarily hard to access through the lens of normal waking consciousness. And so we need to understand the etymology and what that term means. There's also a bit of science that'll come demonstrating what the principal component of the phenomenology or the subjective experience produced by different compounds that could fall into a broad category of psychedelic, what their main component is. Psilocybin, as a classic psychedelic, does promote visions and geometric patterns and more complex visions tied up with strong emotion, as Rick says, but also psychological insight. And that, according to the data, and arguably, but according to the data, at least some data that we've collected, is the most compelling principal component or main thing that the classic psychedelics do. Yes, they promote the visions, but they also promote psychological insight.
I just want to jump in quickly and speak a little bit about some other psychedelic, the one that we at Clearmind developed, which is less known. Our compound MEAI is non-hallucinogenic whatsoever. It doesn't get you into a trip. From people who have experienced MEI without any psychotherapy, they said, and I should say that the reason it's considered to be psychedelic is because it gives you a very light alcohol-like sensation when you take it, even if you didn't have any alcohol whatsoever. And people who took it in the past, they reported that they decreased dramatically the amount of alcohol they usually consume, or they didn't consume any alcohol whatsoever. They felt like they satiated, they didn't want any alcohol. So not all psychedelics are equal. Not all psychedelics behaves the same. And I appreciate everything that was said here, but we develop MEI for alcohol use disorder not as an adjunct to psychotherapy. So there are other options and other psychedelic. And maybe, Mark, maybe you want to expand a little bit, because I always said you say it about yourself, so it's okay for me to say it. You tried MEI and you had similar experience to what I've just described, I think.
Yeah, we've described it as a non-hallucinogenic psychedelic. As you consume it, if you're consuming it sequentially with different doses, it starts out feeling a bit like MDMA, no, a bit like alcohol. And then it becomes MDMA-like, where you connect with other people and you feel relaxed and euphoric. And then it has this weird satiation response that just makes you want to stop. And what we have seen anecdotally in the community is people stop wanting to do things like drinking. So we believe that it could be useful for people taking it outside of the context of therapy, because it really isn't about insight. It's just about stopping drinking.
Yeah, I see a question in the chat about cluster headaches. And so that's one of the interesting examples of a non-psychedelic psychedelic that can be helpful. Now, that's not for a psychological condition. That's a physiological condition worse than migraines. And what people with cluster headaches through the organization Cluster Busters have discovered that LSD or psilocybin can help break the cycle of cluster headaches and can delay its return, because they're often seasonal for people. And we did some progress, some research about 20 years ago at McLean Hospital at Harvard, interviewing people that had used LSD or psilocybin for cluster headaches and looking at their medical records and demonstrating that it really did have substantial healing potential. But the people at Harvard at the time were not ready to actually move to LSD or psilocybin. They said they would only do so if it was the last resort. Timothy Leary was here, and we're not ready to start giving people LSD or psilocybin unless it's absolutely necessary. So the two doctors doing the study, John Helper and Torsten Passy, decided that they would use bromo-LSD, which is a non-psychedelic version of LSD, and see if that worked. And the assumption that we all had was that it wouldn't work, and then we'd have to go back to doing LSD or psilocybin for cluster headaches. And so they did this experiment, and I kept waiting to hear the results and waiting to hear the results, and I heard nothing. And then I finally learned that the bromo-LSD worked even better than LSD or psilocybin, and they didn't want to tell me because they thought I'd be disappointed, because then we weren't going to get to do LSD or psilocybin research. And I said, no, I'm about what's best for patients. This isn't psychedelic psychotherapy anyway, which is what I'm really interested in. But it was that bromo-LSD, by virtue of not being psychedelic, you can give it in grams. You can give milligrams, you can give grams of it. And with psilocybin, 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams is a hefty dose. With LSD, it's in micrograms. So whatever it does, you can flood the brain with it. With bromo-LSD, it doesn't have the psychedelic component. And so that I think is one of the really good use cases for non-psychedelic psychedelics. And others might be in neuroplasticity and neurodegeneration for traumatic brain injury, like that.
I just add, scientists are allowed to be pedantic and pernickety, and I just wonder whether the case of bromo LSD is one of a non-psychedelic therapeutic, or in a sense, does it have anything to do with psychedelic? If psychedelic means to, illuminate the psyche, make the psyche visible. And I just think the semantics are quite important because, well, they're meant to convey meaning. And so it does become a little illogical, to talk of non-psychedelic psychedelics. So I do think we need to be precise in our definitions and in terms of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's right, Robin. Yeah, because there's nothing psychedelic about bromo-LSD. The
Yeah,
only thing psychedelic about it is it's similar to the LSD molecule.
yeah, quite. And again, just to the human data, say with classic psychedelics, I know it's a little different with MDMA, but aspects of the experience seem to really matter for therapeutic outcomes, and specifically emotional breakthrough and psychological insight. So emotional breakthrough, emotional release, catharsis seem to really matter in the human data for therapeutic outcomes. So to portray the trip as a side effect or a problem is against the evidence. I think that's important to say.
Thank you so much for your insights here. So just to wrap up our theme on the regulatory response and research implications, the question is psychedelic research still ongoing despite the regulatory setbacks or perceived setbacks?
Let me dive into that one. The answer is a huge and resounding yes. If you actually want to know how much psychedelic research is going on, there's an amazing website out there called clinicaltrials.gov. And all of the clinical trials around the planet, including psychedelic ones, have to register there. And it's really easy as a search engine. So I went in there recently and plugged in the word psychedelic and came up with 677 studies. Hallucinogen had 672 studies. MDMA had 162 studies. Psilocybin had 250, LSD 134, and ketamine 1,786. The conclusion is psychedelic research is alive and well. Now, it's interesting, my own university I'm most involved with, which is University of British Columbia, I've been talking to various people there for decades now. And a couple of decades ago, the answer was consistent, and it's too political. We can't go there, it's too political, was the consistent message I got. And now there's a number of psychedelic projects unfolding that aren't controversial. They're just part of the program now. So I'm really encouraged to watch the academic barrier at the university I know well just dropping, and it's being embraced.
I want to add to this and say that, in my opinion, not only that research is still ongoing, I think that there is much more research. You can see that in many, many universities and from the best to the less best, I would say. Not only that there's research in psychedelic, they open specific institution to learn psychedelic. So like Mark said, the answer is yes. And also in my background, I've been involved in many therapeutics, many fields, many applications. None of them is easy. I mean, working with FDA or any regulatory body for that matter is not easy. It's never easy. But I think that what drives me, and I believe that many researchers around the world, is that there's the great promise in psychedelic and the great results that we see in psychedelic on one end. On the other end, we see that for mental disorders or addictions, there are no good solutions. So I'm at least derived by this phenomena that there are not good solutions. Psychedelics hold great promise, and so it doesn't add to the research, but it's for certain will not stop the research.
All right, if there's no other comments there, we'll move globally now. And talking about research and policy, each of you here have worked with research in different countries around the world. Are there any countries that are currently more progressive in terms of their regulatory frameworks or research environments?
Well, I think that from the point of view of just research, there is pretty much an open door for research here in the United States, in England, in many, many countries of the world. I would say that where we start looking at kind of compassionate access, like the special access program that Mark talked about in Canada, is sort of a somewhat of an expansion on just the kind of clinical research. And Australia is very far ahead in that area. They're talking now about moving from clinical research where they have compassionate use, but there is a minimal bit of data gathering, to clinical practice. But I think when we look at the real areas of expansion, they're with state level use in the United States. So that the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative, there's been over 10,000 people have been able to receive psilocybin in the state of Oregon. Some for personal growth, some for treating anxiety, depression, clinical indications of different sort. And that's going to open up in Colorado very soon. It's going to be happening with psilocybin in New Mexico. Colorado has multiple different plant medicines. There's areas that are decriminalized. There's thousands of people have gone down to Mexico for Ibogaine. So it's not formally legal, but it's not illegal. So there's multiple Ibogaine clinics in Mexico. People can go to Jamaica, the Netherlands, Costa Rica, elsewhere for psilocybin retreats. And one of the biggest expansions that we haven't discussed yet in the United States is psychedelic churches. It's absolutely astonishing. There's one in Robin's backyard, practically, the Church of Ambrosia, that has 125,000 members. 125,000 members. And I think what saves them from being really under the thumb of the police is that they don't do mail order. People have to go to the church to pick up the mushrooms, but they can do it at home. They don't need to do it there. So in terms of sort of moving towards, regulated access covered by health insurance, maybe Mark, you can share with us what's actually happening in Canada. Is the special access program covered by national health insurance? There's a bit of that in Australia, but not quite as much as you would like. But there are areas that are moving forward dramatically. And in Ukraine, I'll just mention that they've been left over with these laws from Russia where you can't do research with Schedule I drugs even. And it looks like the Ukrainian government is going to change that. So wherever there's enormous amounts of suffering, they're willing to change the regulatory conditions so that at least research can take place.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, Rick, is relevant on many levels. Because in Vancouver, where I live, Vancouver, Canada, that we have decrim, we have de facto decriminalization. The police have decided to ignore mushroom stores. We used to have cannabis stores. Now that cannabis is legal in Canada, we have mushroom stores, and we have one store that sells psychedelics. In fact, advertised in their front window is LSD and peyote and a variety of different psychedelics. And the police have raided it twice, but never charged anybody. So there's some pressure on the owner financially, but there's no legal pressure. So we have de facto decriminalization, and that is happening in other cities in Canada. And I think it's relevant because it just sends a message to politicians that this is acceptable to the public. And I think as the FDA and Health Canada sit around the boardroom table, they are influenced by the cultural context. And the cultural context in Canada is slowly psychedelics are becoming decriminalized. And I think that's relevant because what you and I saw, Rick, during our phase 2 study under Stephen Harper, a previous conservative government, it was really, really difficult. I mean, we literally had to build a bomb-proof room in the upper floor of a pharmacist to store a tablespoon of MDMA. That was a couple of decades ago, but now under a liberal government, things are moving ahead and they're giving us all the appropriate approvals. So I do see a cultural shift that is reflected in the regulatory messages that we're getting from our governments as well.
I would also like to add the Israeli angle. So in Clearmind, we have submitted protocol for two regulatory bodies. One is the FDA, and the other one is the Israeli Ministry of Health. Although Clearmind is a Canadian company, I'm based out in Israel. And in addition, in Israel, cannabis is not legal. There is medical cannabis, but cannabis for recreational purposes is not considered to be legal. Also, MEAI, the compound that we are developing, is considered to be a controlled substance. And there are like 3 countries where MEAI is considered to be a controlled substance, and the United States is not one of them. Nevertheless, it took us third of the time to receive approval from the Israeli Ministry of Health to go ahead and initiate our clinical trial. Then it took us with FDA. Fortunately enough, we now have approval from both FDA and Israeli Ministry of Health, but it took us less time to get the approval in Israel. So I see more openness from the Israeli government in conducting such research.
Hmm. Australia probably deserves a mention as well. Their psychiatrists can prescribe MDMA therapy for PTSD and psilocybin therapy for depression. So you have this interesting tiered system with, a regulated access for limited populations, but then things like decrim, the state of affairs, in the Bay Area, for example, where there's this sort of gray area. I am reminded, just to bring a bit of balance, perhaps, about harms and the decrim system. I was speaking with a mother local to the Bay Area who lost their child to, I believe, suicide very soon after a big psilocybin experience, and the psilocybin mushrooms were procured through the decrim system. In a sense, it was easy to get them in Oakland, and now they have a campaign, Before You Trip, a group of mothers who've lost people, generally due to impaired judgment, I would say, is a common theme, and accidents and or suicide that have happened in relation to psychedelic experiences. And there's a common gripe that, if you could call it that, that the messaging is problematic. We have very tight control through a regulated system that can manage risk very well, but through a very open access system with very limited messaging around harms or proper practice. I think in every case, there was no sober sitter for these individuals. There's a massive disparity between what's being said in relation to a regulated system where harms really can be mitigated, and then what's happening where there's the largest share of psychedelic use, which is this underground or gray area access. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, no, Robin, I think that's completely right. But I think that what we need to do when we think about it is, what are the harms of prohibition? And it's been difficult for people to understand MAPS's kind of parallel path. One is drug development through the FDA or through regulatory agencies around the world, to have highly trained therapists working with patients under direct supervision, with preparation, with integration, with a lot of support during the MDMA experience, ideally to be covered by insurance. And at the same time, we do think that these decrim should be expanded to legal access.
Yeah.
Without any kind of direct supervision at all, without any kind of medical screening. And I think that context is substantially riskier than the regulated medical route, but at the same time, it's better than the risks of prohibition, where we could talk about where all the underground money goes and the violence in underground markets and the benefits that also come once people can access without fear of criminal prosecution. But what would ideally be there is honest drug education delivered through the schools from a young age, pure drugs. A lot of times the incident that Robin described was probably pure psilocybin, but a lot of times people get into problems with, and in Canada, Vancouver, there was people died from ecstasy contaminated with fentanyl and with other drugs and LSD, LSD-like drugs, N-bomb, the series, that the people that would then die from. So I do think that it's definitely the case that it's riskier in these kind of legal access contexts, but you need to look at that in comparison with the dangers and the risks of the prohibition system.
Yeah. I got to know those cases pretty well. You might know them, Rick. I don't know the mothers that I'm referring to. But there was a feeling that, Michael Pollan's book and a lot of the promissory positive messaging meant that their children just picked up the good news and didn't pick up the sort of safety messaging around the importance of context and setting. So we would love to think that within a regulated system, whether it's for medicine only or it's adult use, that there are some important parameters and safety guide rails in place so that cases like that can't so easily happen. I think they picked up a message that it is sufficiently safe, a 18, 19, 20-year-old to take a big dose of magic mushrooms in whatever context, which is more or less what they did. And things went awry fatally, because of that.
We unfortunately have lost the indigenous wisdom where teenagers would be invited into the teepee or yurt and given a psychedelic in the context of elder supervision and celebration of their transformation into becoming an adult and held by the community as a large. So we've kind of missed something here.
Yeah, strongly agree. In a sense, we're kind of clumsy with this thing that has a much older heritage, and this the learning can happen both ways, I think.
Well, thank you everyone for your insights and comments there. I'm just being conscious of time here, and there's a couple of questions that I would like to touch on. One will be very quick because I know a lot of people want to know. And then the last question, we're going to dive into what we see for the future. So the quick question, I know that everyone is wondering, has funding been affected, whether it be funding for research or funding for nonprofit or investments or whatnot? Has the decision from the FDA affected funding in the industry?
Well, I could say in terms of mainstream funding, I've one exception in the UK with a perfect storm that enabled us to get UK Medical Research Council funding back in 2012 or something for the psilocybin work that we did in depression, published in 2016. But that was the only time I've ever won any mainstream funding that I can think of for depression. for psychedelic research in general. Everything that I've done, the reason why I'm here, rests on philanthropic support. If it hadn't have been there, visionary funders like Amanda Fielding at the Beckley Foundation, I wouldn't be here right now. So much of the psychedelic renaissance rests on people's generosity. Yeah.
So for us as a profit company, a public company, it for sure added another layer of complexity, but it's so difficult to bring money in any event. So I cannot just, it did affect, but not tremendously. So that's my experience.
And certainly my experience is it's always been difficult. It's difficult today, but it always has been.
What really was harmful for us was about 5-6 years ago was the rise of the for-profit psychedelic companies and their initial sort of bubble phase where the stock prices went way up, and that made it impossible for me to continue to raise the sums of money that we needed from philanthropy, because people were saying, oh, if you can raise it from investors, go ahead and do that. My response was that, yeah, if you raise it from investors, it changes everything about what you're doing. The incentives change from if it's from philanthropists. I talked about the transparency is gone now, even at the pharma company that MAPS helped incubate. Then you get people that are sort of traditional pharma people, and they start thinking that we're not building a psychedelic ecosystem. We're now competing with all the other psychedelic companies. And so they don't want to make that information public. And so it was very difficult for us to raise all of the philanthropic money. But now the fact that MAPS and Lykos are separating, there's some donors that are now coming back to say, now that it's clearly philanthropic, we're back to being willing to support what you're doing, particularly where it's like humanitarian projects, like in Ukraine or Lebanon or in Africa, Somaliland, elsewhere. And so I think that there is going to be roughly $100 million put into Lykos soon. So there's still investor money willing to go into projects. But again, most of these are trying to minimize the therapy component. But I think the promise is there, and the funding, even though it's a bit more difficult now, will still be there.
Well, thanks, Rick. So to dive into our next question here, which will be our last question, and then we might have time for one or two questions from the audience. Very recently, the FDA commissioner stated that exploring psychedelic medicine is a top priority for the Trump administration. So I just want to say that as a preface to our last question, which is, as each of you peer into the crystal ball, as is our webinar discussion title for today, how do you see this story unfolding over the next 1 to 3 years, whether it be for public companies or nonprofit research, or clinically from each of your different lenses? What gives you hope, and where do you think we need to be most vigilant? Peering into the crystal ball.
Well, say within the next, let's expand it to 4 years. So within the next 4 years, I believe that MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD will be approved by the FDA. I think that both Compass and Usona are likely to get psilocybin approved. Compass for treatment-resistant depression, Usona for major depressive disorder. My current guess, and I don't know if this is accurate, is that Usona will be first before Compass, because it's difficult to enroll subjects with treatment-resistant depression. They have to have failed on multiple different non-drug psychotherapies, non-psychedelic, like SSRIs, or psychotherapies. So the Compass enrollment has been dramatically slowed. I think there's a good chance that 5-MeO-DMT could become a medicine as well. It might take a little bit longer than 4 years or 5 years, but I think we will have a dramatically expanded body of psychedelics that psychedelic therapists can choose from in the next 4 years.
I'll just, back what Rick says there. Psilocybin will be first for depression, probably. how soon, I don't have any special inside information, but maybe 2027 approved, FDA approved. Whether it's Compass or Usona first, MDMA therapy for PTSD within the time frame that we're talking about, approved. I don't know when. Rick would know better than me, but it's going to happen. And then, yeah, Ibogaine, 5-MeO, could that happen within a slightly broader window? Underground practitioners who assume freedoms seem to work a lot with 5-MeO. I think that's quite telling. I think it's convenient for it, it's pragmatic, it's a short experience, and they seem to go with that rather than, say, pure NN-DMT. So there's something about 5-MeO. So let's say 2028, Ibogaine, 5-MeO. I know Ibogaine has complexities, but psilocybin's a pretty confident bet in a pretty short period of time, I think, perhaps especially under the current administration. Yeah.
It's interesting, there's always an interplay between cultural public opinions and regulatory authorities, because they also exist within the cultural context. There was a relatively recent poll of Canadians that was a representative sample of Canadians, and the question was, do you support the giving of psilocybin mushrooms for people who are at their end of life? And the vast majority of Canadians supported that. And cannabis was legalized in Canada, not because of a clinical trial process, but public opinion. And so public opinion and regulatory authorities' approval does interplay. And what I'm seeing is a linear growth of the acceptance of psychedelics by the public. And I think that will result in more and more approvals, which then increases public acceptance. So that ongoing cyclical reinforcement, I think, will continue.
Yeah, one factor we didn't mention is that there's well over 1,000 ketamine clinics in the United States right now. So that's really changing people's attitudes. So whether it's pharmacological without any therapy, or it's in the better clinics, it's ketamine with therapy, people are really starting to understand and hearing many, many stories of people who benefited from ketamine. There's also, ketamine being among the most, or the most addictive of all the psychedelics. There are a lot of sad stories of people that get dependent on ketamine or die in accidents, or seemingly think that they should, save humanity by going to Mars or something like that. But I do think that the ketamine experience is laying the groundwork for the expansion of psychedelic psychotherapy.
Not to be repetitive of what everyone else said, just to add that I believe that we will hear about additional compounds that will come to the clinics, some second generation, third generation of psychoactive components. And I believe that this kind of research will become more and more traditional. It will come closer to traditional pharmaceutical research. And I believe that more big pharma will stop sitting on the fences and will take an active role in the development of those substances or molecules for many, many indications.
Perfect. Thank you, Adi. Well, I have you there. There's one quick question in the chat that I will just ask you in terms of regulatory aspects. And the question is, what do you see as the biggest scientific or regulatory hurdle to bringing a compound like MEAI to mainstream clinical use?
I think prejudice. When we submitted our protocol in the first time to FDA, we didn't want them to be stuck on the word psychedelic, and MEI comes with a warning from Canadian Ministry of Health because it was sold online. I would be politically correct and say somewhere in the gray zone. And we really wanted to FDA to look at the safety data that we gained, before going to first in human studies, the safety data that you have is in clinical settings, and it's according to FDA regulation. So we really wanted FDA to concentrate on the very good safety data that we submitted them in a very nice package, but no, they were prejudiced, and that's the main hurdle in bringing not only psychedelic, but also a novel psychedelic that FDA has never heard about before.
Great. Thank you. And there's one more question here, and this can be open to all. And it is, what are your recommendations for advocates and communicators to play a role in building and shaping the industry?
So if let me jump first on this one. I think that we see more and more advocates to psychedelic treatment, speaking from their own experience, coming from the Hill, congressmen. I just attended a conference when two congressmen from the Democratic I don't believe that it slipped out of my mind, but the Republican, yes, sorry for that. I'm deep in local politics, but they spoke about legislation for psychedelic. They spoke about how important it is. We had people, veterans, high ranks veterans, pilots, SEALs speaking about their own experience. So I think that more and more people speaking from their own experience and sharing their experience. You know, it's not that easy to say I had PTSD, I had depression, whatever, and I used psilocybin, MDMA, whatever psychedelic or psychoactive compound they used, stepping out and saying, yes, I never tried anything, I don't drink or whatever, but I did use psychedelic as a psychotherapy and it helped me. That is great, and we hear more and more people speaking about their personal experience with psychedelics. So I think it's a huge addition to the space, and they also, because they are also legislator, so they can help also with legislation around the use of psychedelic and making psychedelic and approved treatments.
I'd like to add, if it's okay, that you know, where we are does rest on the science that's been done, and that there's some evidence, and that's what, you know, Michael Pollan leveraged when he wrote his best-selling book, and we talk about the Michael Pollan effect and so on. I think there could be a danger of getting ahead of evidence with advocacy and then forcing, in a sense, a reaction to that. And so to advocates, I would say, try, please, as much as possible to be close to the evidence and not to go beyond it.
I completely agree. I'm saying that when those people who really has the power, the legislator, they have their own experience, it makes it easier for them to make the legislation that we need as an industry. And of course, the bottom line, or the first line, whatever, is safety. And we don't want to, even with the biggest promise and the biggest help that we can provide to people who are really suffering, first of all, we must keep their safety. So no argument about that. But when you have, you know, it's not.
Zadie's frozen. I would just add, my point was a very general one.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I meant. That the moment that people with power to who works in the Senate, they have the power and they have to move things, because we do eventually, we want to move things. We want things to go quicker. We want things to be better. So they have the power, and when it comes with a personal experience, it's, in my opinion, this is wonderful, and this is something that it's a phenomena that is expanding now.
Yeah. My point was, just very briefly, my point is a very general one, and it's just that, you know, if we argue from a position of science, evidence, sophistication, then you know, you flagged stigma as being the greatest problem, and I'd agree. Then we're the evidence-based, sophisticated voice, and
Yeah,
I think that's really where our power hand is in what's developing.
completely
Yeah, and
agree.
I would add that a lot of the criticism that I've got is, oh, you're an advocate, you know, how can we trust you to do unbiased research? You know, you believe it works and you're an advocate, so therefore you don't know how to do science. And so my response and my suggestion to advocates is similar to what Robin said, is that if someone accuses advocates of being biased, I'd say, talk about the methodology. What is the methodology of our studies? Do you have any suggestions for how we can improve the methodology? Like Robin talked about starting to gather evidence about expectancy effect. That's a positive suggestion that's worth implementing. But in general, we get this idea like, oh, you're an advocate, therefore your data can't be trusted. And so I just try to get the conversation focused on methodology, because that's the whole purpose of it, of scientific methodology. And I think this concept of pharmaceutical companies who have, you know, financial interests in getting their drugs approved, this idea that somehow or other pharma companies are completely unbiased and they can do whatever, but, you know, advocates for psychedelics who also talk about advocates for drug policy reform, all of a sudden, and in particular, this gets to this idea of if you've done the drug yourself, now you're no longer capable of being a scientist, you're no longer capable of being unbiased, you're completely corrupted, you could say, by your own experience, and that therefore, you know, and again, my suggestion is just for advocates to focus, say, talk to me about my methodology. Is there any ways that you have to suggest that the methodology be improved?
And more than that, I don't believe it's relevant, because just like I don't think that any drug that was brought from the laboratory to the market, every time someone needs to believe in this drug and to speak in favor of the drug, otherwise the drug will never make the trip to the market. So it doesn't really matter whether it's psychoactive, psychedelic, some other molecule to cure cancer. So for me, it's really irrelevant argument, and has nothing to do with reality, because at the end of the day, it's not like if we are advocates or we in favor of some kind of a treatment, it doesn't necessarily means that it will somehow quickly get to the market. We still need to go through each and every step and each and every phase, and to show safety and efficacy. So it's completely irrelevant, in my opinion.
I think, Rick, your ongoing lifelong commitment to transparency is also part of the answer. If you want to accuse me of this, that, or the other, well, look at the website. It's all there. You can check it out for yourself.
Well, thank you. I know we are over time here, so I just want to say that we definitely appreciate everyone staying a little bit longer. Before we wrap it up, I'll just give the speakers one more chance to give any last words that they would like.
Well, I'll just add that if anybody's interested, Psychedelic Science 2025 from June 16th to the 20th in Denver, to show the vibrancy of the psychedelic community. You know, Mark, you talked about the number of projects in clinicaltrials.gov. I'll just share that we had over 1,500 people applied to give presentations at Psychedelic Science, and we'll have about 500 different speakers, many of them on panels. And we will be videotaping everything. Everything will go up online for free. We're in the midst of trying to figure out if we can live stream some of it. So if people really want to come, if they don't mind, if they're from Canada trying to get into the United States or from some other country to take that risk of traveling through our borders right now, I'd just like to encourage people to come. And then even if you don't, after the conference, there'll be an enormous wealth of information from the videotapes of all the presentations.
And I remain optimistic. If I look at all of the psychedelic research, it generally proves that it's promising. And I look at all of the current existing mental health treatments, and they're generally relatively ineffective compared to what the psychedelic medicines offer. And that consistent message coming out from many different research organizations on many different molecules with many different diagnoses says we will eventually have access to these medicines. Just the sheer logic of their safety and efficacy compels us to start to explore them seriously. And I think that will happen. I think it's the weight of the evidence will eventually be recognized by all levels of government.
And for me, just quick word to everyone who joined us today to continue follow us, to support us in the journey that we have decided to take and bring, what we believe to be good treatments all the way from the bench to the market and help people who needs those treatments to get better. So support us and continue follow us and follow the journey.
Just around things, I was wondering. Yeah, I mean, I just agree with what's being said, and Mark's message there. I think it's a matter of time, and the weight of the evidence is favoring this arc towards, in a sense, a more sophisticated policy on psychedelics and psychedelic therapy. So there's very much reason to be optimistic.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to all of our speakers for being here today. It's been a very interesting conversation, and I know we could dive a lot deeper into a lot of the topics that we touched on today. So I just wanted to say that we really appreciate your time and your opinions and your comments and insights today. And for those who joined us today live, there will be a recording and transcript sent out. And if you'd like to stay involved, you can follow our speakers and Clearmind on their social media. And also, if you'd like to make a donation to MAPS, you can do so at maps.org/donate. It should be in the chat. And also, if you'd like to support Dr. Carhart-Harris's research, you can do so at the link that is in the chat as well. So watch for the replay and share it with your network. And of course, you can join us next month at Psychedelic Science, as Rick mentioned, where many of us will be continuing this conversation live. So on behalf of the team at Clearmind, thank you again to all the speakers and everyone who attended today to watch live. And we look forward to staying connected. So bye for now.